I'm Anthony Elstob, and this is my video on design process. Over the years of being a user experience designer, I've often been part of agile scrum teams that practice the typical ceremonies you'd expect. Stand-ups, planning, show and tells and retrospectives, the latter being of particular importance for this video. Over the course of my career and studies, I've been exposed to different design frameworks, such as Design Council's Double Diamond, McKinsey's Grade Model, IBM's Loop, and more. I've begun to realise these frameworks all have similarities, and one in particular is around the need for looping, by observing, reflecting, and then iterating in some shape or form. These loops often focus on the end user by testing the design or conducting research, and then using those insights to iterate. It's not until much later that a designer might also reflect on their own actions and insights. Reflection is a key theme here. Reflecting on a designer's own actions should include considering what they did, what went well, what didn't, what they learned from the experience, and what might they change. Arguably, you might say Scrum's retrospective ceremonies do just that, but in fact, it's likely the designer has already conducted the full task at hand, or at least have made significant headway. I'd like to discuss then the opportunity of reflecting in rather than on. For example, reflection whilst in midst of research, rather than on it. This is known as action research. In 1946, psychologist Kurt Lewin wrote a paper titled Action Research and Minority Problems, where he describes action research as research which will help the practitioner. Further, he adds about the requirements from the practitioner. In particular, there exists a great amount of goodwill, of readiness to face the problem squarely and really do something about it. A paper by two of his former students, Cartwright and Zander, written in 1953, went on to summarise action research as action research was the means of systematic enquiry for all participants in the quest for greater effectiveness through democratic participation. Summed up, action research is a democratic reflective process that requires practitioners to be completely honest and reflect on the process whilst in action rather than on it. There needs to be willingness to want to investigate and to subjectively dissect one's own actions. Fast forward to the 80s, when academic professor and researcher Ortrun Superscarrett has begun to publish and teach the concept and frameworks for action research, particularly of its use in higher education, thesis development, and within the social sciences. In an interview with Curtin University in 1998, they talk about action research and discusses a fundamental point that researchers should see methods as secondary, and that the intent, epistemology, and theory should be the researcher's drivers. They later discuss how the researcher needs to push through the mindset of positivism and use field research of observation and reflection, and from there, form concepts and generalizations of their own empirical research. They also speak about Reg Revens, who was a pioneer for action learning, who taught and helped organisations by using peer-to-peer techniques to self-diagnose and encourage the asking and exploration of questions about the unknown in their problem spaces. Going back to Superscarrett and their discussion of intent in epistemology, it highlights the importance to be mindful of our own values and biases. In the paper, Bridging Mindfulness in Design, the authors discuss how becoming mindless can make designers run on autopilot, which can introduce unconscious influences in our designs and research. Conversely, they then also discuss being mindful, becoming aware and conscious of potential influences. Furthermore, a third state in relation to Sean is discussed where mindful and mindless, or automatic, are intrinsically balanced in the process of designing. From this literature review, I conducted a self-evaluation and also asked peers to give me feedback in order to get an insight into my own values and what unconscious influences I may exhibit, which I'll discuss shortly. To expand on the concept of action learning and reflection whilst in design or research, there are several models that can be used. The key, however, is not to just use them straight out the box, but to tailor them to your own workflow. There are two that caught my attention from a UX point of view, which are Gibbs's reflection cycle, which was developed by Graham Gibbs in the 80s. It's said to be a framework for examining experiences and works by conducting cycles of evaluation. Another is by Kurt Lewin, created in 1946. Another cycle-based reflective model, but this one is broad. The model uses a simple plan, act, observe and reflect cycle. This one in particular caught my attention because of its broadness. In UX design and research, there often can be a lot of unknowns, adaptability on the fly, and scope changes. Therefore, Lewin's model seems appropriate to allow the broadness of the cycle to be a catch-all for all of those unknown moments. Now I'd like to share how I applied all of this knowledge and what I've learned from it. As mentioned, I conducted my own reflective activities where I considered my personal development plan, what I wanted to get out of action research, and how might I apply it to daily work. Thereafter, I produced a 360 survey that I sent to my peers. It contained 10 questions and the responses were anonymous. I asked my colleagues to rank 8 statements using a Likert scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The final 2 questions were qualitative, which asked for examples of any particularly positive experiences with me, and the other for any areas of improvement. Whilst awaiting feedback from my peers, I reflected on my own values in relation to what influences I may bring consciously and unconsciously to my work. A device known as Wheel of Awareness originates from psychiatrist Daniel J. Siegel. It's a device that promotes awareness in the practitioner. It provides a framework to examine thoughts and actions and encourages methodical thinking and mindfulness. It can be adapted to self-assess many things, including values. A simpler version of the device is adapted within the paper A Design-Relevant Mindfulness Device, and I used this to conduct my self-observation over the space of 2 to 3 days. My conclusion after completing the task found some commonalities between some of the roles, as well as some connections to my personal development plan that I'm actively striving towards. This was good and helped to solidify that some of my values are contributing to what I want to achieve. Thereafter, combining the insights from my 360 feedback and with my values work, I had a heightened sense of awareness the following couple of weeks of what things I might need to reconsider in my approach to activities. This awareness helped to get to the final main device in relation to action research. Before that, a recap on what I've now gathered. Action research is about learning and observing in research and design, not just on it. It's important to think about and be aware of the epistemology and methods I, as the practitioner, conduct. There's a need to be mindful and awareness for conscious and unconscious influences. And finally, a willingness to be open to the effectiveness of my activities. As discussed earlier, Lewin's Plan, Act, Observe and Reflect model seemed most appropriate within my field of UX. I used this as my initial draft and conducted a review of my daily activities and my work. I did this for 5 days, before then completing a quick affinity mapping exercise to see what themes were beginning to emerge. Thereafter, I came to some conclusions about my model so far. The model, albeit broad, was actually too broad. A lot of repetition could be seen between certain parts on different days. Sometimes there wasn't much difference in some parts because the task I was working on spanned multiple days. I found contradictions in some of my tasks that went against the values I'd identified, and the frequency of doing daily reflections weren't producing anything of real value. Using these final insights, I created a second version with the additional step of consult. This was added because consulting and liaising within other disciplines as a multidisciplinary team is key for my role. Plus, due to the pandemic, there's an additional need for ensuring clear communication is happening through video and other digital channels. I also decided to change the frequency to cycles, ranging from 2 to 3 days, which added more value as there wasn't much duplication and allowed more flexibility depending on my workload. Finally, I added an additional task of using emojis as a tool of measuring how the last cycle went. Over time, this means I can then begin to see trends and use that data to pinpoint what sort of action may be contributing to it, and then reflect and design my method for or against it. In conclusion, my take on action research within the UX space is that it's a process that allows practitioners to consider their methods and identify things going well or things that perhaps need addressing. It's important to find a frequency and methodology that suits your ways of working to ensure you're getting the most out of it and to reduce any duplication. This project demonstrates there is room for this kind of reflective research in the UX space, and perhaps challenges the status quo of the typical retrospective activities that a lot of agile teams conduct today.